The basement's air held the weight of decades. It was thick with dust that caught in the throat, carrying the sharp metallic tang of damp concrete. Elias stood in the dead center of the room. He did not move at first. He let his eyes adjust, but there was nothing to see. The darkness here was absolute, a heavy, physical presence that pressed against his skin from every direction. He shifted his weight, the soles of his boots scraping against the uneven floor, with a sound that seemed too loud, too intrusive in the suffocating quiet. He reached out, his fingers brushing against cold, jagged stone. The walls felt miles away, yet they hemmed him in, closing off the world above. There was no sound of wind, no hum of distant machinery, only the slow, rhythmic thud of his own pulse. He stood still, listening to the silence. It was not empty, it was waiting. The isolation was total, a void that swallowed his presence, leaving him anchored in a space where time had stopped. He took a breath, the air tasting of earth and rot, and waited for the stillness to break. He was alone in the dark, and the dark was absolute. Elias reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed against the rough, cardboard surface of a matchbox. He pulled it out, the movement slow and deliberate in the suffocating stillness. He gripped the match, the wood smooth and dry against his thumb. He pressed the head of the match against the striking strip. A sharp, abrasive rasp echoed through the room, a sudden intrusion that shattered the heavy silence. He pulled his hand back. A tiny, brilliant point of light flared to life. The flame sputtered, then steadied, casting a violent, flickering glow. Long, jagged shadows leaped against the walls, dancing in frantic, distorted shapes as the light fought for purchase. He held the match steady, his hand motionless, watching the sulfurous heat pulse against the surrounding void. The darkness did not vanish, but it retreated, pushed back by the small, defiant sphere of orange light. The light had arrived. Elias held the match steady, the flame dancing at the tip of the wood. He turned his head, his eyes scanning the immediate radius of the light. A few paces away, a wooden crate sat against the wall, its surface scarred and stained by time. A thick, white candle stood upright on the crate. He stepped toward it, his boots making soft, rhythmic thuds on the concrete. The flame in his hand flickered, casting long, sweeping shadows. He reached out, his fingers hovering inches from the candle. The air near the crate was colder, smelling of stale wax and trapped humidity. He leaned in, his breath hitching as he brought the match closer. The flame touched the wick. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, the wick blackened, curled, and ignited. A small, steady amber glow bloomed, pushing back the darkness. Elias pulled his hand back, watching the flames settle into a quiet, unwavering pillar of light. The oppressive void now retreated. The darkness remained, but it was no longer absolute. The room had begun to breathe. Elias turned away from the crate, leaving the first amber glow behind. He moved with caution, his hands outstretched to map the unseen contours of the room. His fingers grazed cold, uneven stone as he navigated the periphery. The darkness felt heavier here, pressing against his shoulders, but he kept his focus on the floor. He stepped over a jagged piece of metal, his boots finding purchase on the slick concrete. A few feet further, his hand met the smooth, hard surface of a second candle. He leaned down, shielding the small flame he carried, and touched it to the wick. The second candle flared, casting a wider net of light. The second candle flared, catching the glint of rusted iron nearby. He squinted, identifying a pile of discarded tools, their edges dulled by oxidation. He did not stop there. He pushed deeper into the shadows, his eyes adjusting to the shifting geometry of the room. In the far corner, he spotted the third candle. The bindings were brittle, the paper yellowed and curled. He reached out, the heat of his match warming the air, and brought the flame to the wick. The third light caught, sending a fresh wave of brightness across the floor. The rusted tools and the forgotten books emerged from the gloom, their shapes sharpening. Elias stood for a moment, letting the glow from the third candle settle against the wall. He turned his gaze toward the far corner, where the shadows remained thick and unyielding. The darkness there seemed to possess a weight of its own. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the rough texture of the matchbox. He pulled out a single match. He struck it against the side of the box, the sound sharp and sudden. A new flame bloomed, brighter and more intense. He walked toward the corner, his boots crunching on loose grit. The shadows retreated, but they were slow to yield. He found the fourth candle tucked into a narrow crevice, its wax gray and hardened by years of neglect. He leaned forward, the heat of the match radiating against his skin. He touched the flame to the wick. It caught instantly. The light surged outward, hitting the corner with clarity. The darkness was forced back, dissolving into the edges of the room. Elias turned his back on the now cleared corners. The center of the basement remained a dark, hollow heart. He walked toward the middle, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. The air shifted, growing cooler and heavier as he approached. The central table stood like an island in the gloom, a heavy wooden structure covered in a thick layer of dust. He reached out, his hand hovering over the surface. It was cold to the touch. A cluster of candles sat there, their wicks long and untouched. The shadows here were different. They did not just sit in the corners. They seemed to pulse, clinging to the wood and the table legs. He stopped. The silence in this part of the room was absolute, a vacuum that seemed to pull the light from his previous efforts. He reached into his pocket, his fingers finding the last match in the box. He gripped it, the wood rough against his skin. He took a steady breath, feeling the cool air fill his lungs, and prepared to strike. The shadows waited, motionless. Elias dragged the match head across the box. A sharp hiss cut through the silence, and a bright, defiant spark flared into life. He shielded the tiny flame with his cupped palm as the surrounding shadows surged forward, a sudden draft threatening to snuff out his progress. He did not flinch. He leaned over the table, his hand steady despite the cold. He touched the flame to the first wick, then the second, then the third. The fire jumped from one candle to the next, a chain reaction of light that raced across the wooden surface. One by one, the wicks caught, their flames merging into a single, growing hearth. The darkness that had clung to the table legs recoiled, shredded by the sudden influx of heat and brilliance. The air itself seemed to change, losing its heavy, stagnant quality as the room erupted in a warm, steady glow. The menacing shadows that had occupied the space for years were pushed back, dissolving into the corners until they vanished entirely. The basement was no longer a hollow, oppressive void. It was bathed in light, every inch of the concrete floor and the wooden structure now clearly defined. The transformation was absolute. The darkness had been completely banished. The light from the central table pulsed, but it was still contained. Elias turned his head, his gaze sweeping across the far wall where a heavy, rectangular object hung. It was a mirror, buried under decades of gray dust and cobwebs. He stepped toward it, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He reached out, his palm pressing against the cold, clouded surface. With a slow, deliberate motion, he dragged his hand across the glass. The dust fell away in thick, dry clumps, revealing the silvered surface beneath. The moment the glass cleared, the light from the candles caught it. A beam of amber radiance bounced off the mirror, striking the opposite wall with sudden intensity. The reflection amplified the brightness tenfold, throwing light into the deepest crevices of the room. Shadows that had clung to the ceiling and the far corners were instantly erased. The basement, once a tomb of stagnant air and forgotten history, was now a brilliant, radiant workspace. Elias stepped back, watching the light dance across the polished surfaces. The transformation was complete. The darkness had been dismantled by the simple, multiplying power of the light. Elias stood in the center of the room, his breath slow and steady. The silence that remained was no longer heavy or suffocating. It was the quiet of a space waiting to be used. He looked down at his hand. Between his thumb and forefinger, he held the small, cardboard box. It was light, almost weightless, yet it had been the catalyst for everything he saw around him. He shook the box, hearing the faint, dry rattle of the remaining matches inside. He had not needed a massive spotlight, a roaring furnace, or a complex machine to reclaim this space. He had only needed the first match. He walked to the central table and set the box down on the wood. The light from the candles flickered, steady and unwavering, casting his own shadow long and clear against the concrete wall. He watched the flame of the nearest candle, observing how it held its ground against the vastness of the room. The scale of the basement had not changed, but its purpose had. It was a place of potential. He realized then that the size of the spark did not dictate the scale of the result. One only needs to be the source of the light.